3.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Myth-Busting the Cannabis Sector panel. Happy Cannabis Day to everyone listening in today. My name is Sherry Altschuler, and I'm a partner in the Capital Markets Group at Aird & Burles and a member of our cannabis team. Aird & Burles is a Toronto-based full-service firm with a significant cross-disciplinary cannabis practice. Today we're talking about myth-busting in the cannabis sector, and there's a lot of misconceptions around this sector, and we're here today to start changing some of the negative narrative that's out there and the stigmas about the industry. Here to help us set the record straight are a group of industry leaders, and let me introduce you to them. This is all audio, but to my right is John Fowler. John is the CEO of Supreme Cannabis Company, which is a TSXV listed company. And he's been a long-time cannabis activist, having spent nearly 15 years in the cannabis industry across all manner of roles, from cultivator to patient, right advocate to attorney. In 2013, he founded 7 Acres, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Supreme. And since then, John has developed 7 Acres into Canada's leading provider of premium cannabis flower, focused on scaling the methods needed to maintain industry-leading quality at scale. Hi, John.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. We also have Michael Garbaz. Michael is Corporate Strategy and Legal Counsel at Canna Royalty. And he's considered a next-generation cannabis industry expert and strategist. Michael's ideas shape the industry and stakeholders across the industry, from corporate finance specialists to PhD scientists. Thanks, Michael, for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me.
And last but certainly not least is Corey Hersku. Corey is the founder of Rainmaker PR. He's a media and technology commentator who has evolved into an always-on publicist focused on innovation and cannabis. Thanks for joining us, Corey.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's jump into the first thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is cannabis has, in Canada, we have a long history of criminalizing cannabis, and it dates back to the 1920s. When I tell people I operate in this industry, I often get a question of why we're legalizing. It usually comes from one of my family members or neighbors or a friend who says, why are we legalizing cannabis in Canada? And, you know, we jump into discussions about how Canada's medical cannabis laws were born, and they were born out of, Section 56 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which provides an exemption, and then various constitutionally based challenges that advanced that medicinal regime. I'd like to get this started from hearing from our panelists about public policy and constitutional based arguments for legalization, and how those arguments will be impacted or may be impacted by a rec market. Should I turn it over to you, John, first?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, fundamentally, to me, the answer why we're legalizing cannabis is because the prohibition of cannabis hasn't worked. In terms of eradicating drug use in this country with cannabis, clearly it's been ineffective. And in fact, we have some of the highest incidences of use in the world, and particularly amongst young people, really showing that our policies and decisions are not leading to the policy outcomes that we're looking for. I think what's exciting about legalization is the opportunity to approach from more of a health and social outcome perspective, to remove the stigmatization, particularly for young people, of criminalization, which really has an impact, on travel, employment, and many other things in life. And to be quite frank, it creates great economic opportunity. We're a country that has billions of dollars, some say as high as $10 billion per year in an illicit market, and being able to transition that demand into a legal supply chain with creating legal jobs, more opportunity for taxation, and I think particularly for companies like ours and some of the other ones in Canada, we're bringing jobs to rural Ontario or other parts of the country that have lost manufacturing and resource jobs historically, and we're bringing great employment with a compelling, exciting industry. And I think when you add those all together, it's not about getting high, it's not about just having a good time or days like today, it's really about a right choice for Canada and leading a good example for the world, and the world is watching.
Great.
Yeah, I think John hit most of the key points there. I mean, it almost flipped the question on its head of why we're legalizing cannabis. Is why is cannabis illegal right now, at least from an adult use perspective? And without going sort of through the historical timeline of cannabis use, sort of widespread across North America and really the world historically, and how, for various political reasons, we ended up criminalizing the use of cannabis on an adult level. If you really look at it today, in terms of from a scientific perspective, if you're comparing it to other substances that are being consumed, for a lot of the reasons John mentioned around the stigmas associated around cannabis use and how fair those might be from a health perspective, from a social perspective, I think more and more the science is catching up, the stigma is catching up and slowly fading, and really from a societal perspective, we have the opportunity to ensure a clean supply chain. So as John mentioned, you have a $10 billion illicit market. Let those consumers use something that's been tested, going through a clean supply chain, doesn't have pesticides, it's consistent, you have the same experience every time, so you're not having sort of unsafe use, definitely in terms of harm reduction from an adult purpose, but also across for youth in terms of how we're regulating that supply chain and who has access to product. So I think all in all, this is something it's going to have a great societal benefit. I think there's going to be a ton of tax revenue generated from the government, even though that's probably not a first priority. And ultimately, yeah, like prohibition didn't work, and this is a program that I think has all the makings of a really successful cannabis program.
Yeah, you know what? You guys have both nailed everything. When you look back at Canada, and Canada builds itself as a very progressive country, a very open country, a very free country, forward-thinking country, yeah, cannabis is illegal. So I think that's it ties into why they want to prove that they're the country that they say they are.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you touched upon the protection of youth, and that's one of the primary objectives of legalizing the adult use market and if you look to the rationale that our government at least has focused on, it's protection of youth and the regulation of an existing industry, the proper regulation of an existing industry. And back in 2015, our Prime Minister campaigned on this, and it was a promise. And fairly swiftly after that, the task force came out with recommendations. So, I think that people on the street probably understand the rationale behind, a medicinal market. But what about the rec market? Why is that important? What's important about that piece?
So I think if we're pragmatic, Canadians are already consuming cannabis. So I think some of the dialogue, particularly on the legislative process, speaks about it as though this is going to be new. The reality is cannabis is pervasive across Canada. As I said, there's many studies that show that we're near the top of the world in terms of frequency of use. So with that in mind, we might as well get the best possible outcomes we can with that. In terms of taking illicit jobs, there's questions around organized crime, things of that nature, and transitioning those into legal jobs with tax consequences and good economic development for especially rural communities. It means for consumers providing the safest product possible, not just in terms of technical quality, but I think also education. I think responsible use is the key in anything. Whether that's things like alcohol or cannabis, or whether that's things like even exercise or working too much. Sitting in a law firm, I think that's important to consider. So you need to do everything in moderation to have a good outcome, and you need to understand what you're using. What I'm most excited about is the amount of research and trade education that we can do through legalization to encourage better outcomes for those who do choose to consume cannabis.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, especially around education, which seems to keep coming up as a theme today. And when you have this illicit recreational market, what it causes in terms of the minds of consumers is they're going to either a drug dealer or a dispensary, and they're going to a black market, and they're purchasing substances. And for them, they're having pretty innocuous effects. They feel like they're okay. The government's moving towards that. But from a legal perspective, it's really, a lot of the time, it's the same types of people that could be pushing other types of drugs, or if it's not that same person, it's still the legal implications are similar. So so if you're a user in your mind, to have like that gateway effect of saying, hey, this is something that's right now illegal, there are other things that are illegal. Cannabis seems like it's relatively fine. The government's moving towards taking steps to say that, like from an adult use perspective, this is going to be okay. In a consumer's mind, in the illegal market, it really creates a misconception around the status of cannabis, and ultimately leads to negative outcomes for consumption of other drugs, in my opinion. And I think by actually legalizing it, regulating it, and taking the supply chain into a legal forum, you ultimately crush that in terms of the minds of consumers, and they look at cannabis similarly to how they look at alcohol, whereas people wouldn't say alcohol is a gateway drug to other types of drugs, but it would be if you had to go to a drug dealer to get every time you wanted whiskey or tequila or gin. And I think it's a really key point around education, that like we're understanding that this isn't heroin, and that this is something that's pretty innocuous, and that we understand sort of the delta of where health benefits and health consequences of cannabis fit, and we're comfortable with that from a science perspective.
And so we're going to have a medicinal regime, we have a rec regime, and we have an ability of people to grow at home. And because the theme is myth-busting here, one of the concerns is, how are all these going to fit together? How will they work together? And that there will be an unlimited supply of cannabis out there for everyone to access, and it's going to be a bit of a Wild West scenario. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the medical program, it's obviously been super successful to date. You have, I think, over 250,000 patients, and growing every day across Canada, using cannabis to help treat either specific symptoms or a host of symptoms, and ultimately the patients are finding that the quality of life has been improving pretty significantly using different forms of cannabis. So I think it's great that the medical system will continue. I think one hot button issue that I think everyone in the room probably feels pretty strongly about would be that taxation of medical cannabis, as well as, taxation of medical cannabis shouldn't exist, but also improving access to patients, whether that's from a retailing perspective or an online perspective, lowering costs in terms of providing insurance coverage, understanding from a workplace and just a general accommodation perspective that this is a medical treatment that's being prescribed by doctors, that scientists are approving of, and that we need to sort of treat it as such. So I think it's awesome to see the movement, and that the medical program will still be part of the program going forward. I think on the recreational side, there's obviously going to be a ton of challenges. I think everyone in the industry is aware of that. I think the government's aware of that, both at the regulation level and also at the retailing level and distribution level, where they're actively setting up their own government-run supply chains in specific provinces. I think the government's doing the best to get prepared for its timeline of legalization, and there's going to be challenges undoubtedly, and I think we're all expecting that, and it's really about having as much product as possible to meet consumer demand to help accomplish the government's goal of getting rid of the black market, and also to allow the program to ultimately thrive. So it will be an exciting few months ahead, undoubtedly.
An exciting 2018 and into 2019, I'm sure.
When you say the difference between medicinal and recreational, there's like even that in itself is starting to become very ambiguous and very broad. And like, what to say one person smoking it recreationally isn't doing medicinally because they have a pain in their back, but you also can't compare that to people who are actually taking medicinally for like epilepsy, and kids who you see all the time who have gone from not being able to function daily without like they're having seizures, and then you give them a drop and it's gone down to 1 or nothing. So you look at both of them as just like, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to almost a hyperbolic tone where people are like aggressively needing to use it all the time. There's people who are still like, they don't need to function. They can still go to work and be totally fine. But at night, they want to help them fall asleep. And I think it's going to start to bleed. It's just not bleed. It's going to start to bond together more, and it's going to be interesting to see how medicinal and recreational roll out and see how it actually starts to define itself differently.
Yeah, I want to take off on that point because I think that's actually spot on. Like, I think you'll have a medical pharma system where people are being prescribed an actual dosage form that's comfortable for a patient, a pharmacist, a doctor, so like a pill, a patch, or something that they can actually dose and measure effectively. And that will be continued to be prescribed for people who have ailments that we have good scientific understanding that that's a use for cannabis. And then I think on the recreational side, and I'll speak to the middle in a second, there's always going to be consumers who are, heavy consumers, and that's what they're doing, and they're looking after trying to get really significant effects out of it, and it might be like an escape mechanism or a recreational tool for them. And I think the big sort of middle area is I think where we're going to see a ton of growth. And I think we'll see both camps, users starting to identify themselves in the middle as sort of like wellness users. So on the medical side, it's people who might not be using it for a specific ailment, but are finding that their quality of life has improved, whether they're elderly or deal with pain or deal with anxiety or stress or stomach issues. It's just something that for them, it might not be a tablet that's going after a specific ailment, but for them, smoking their vape pen or their edible or smoking a joint or having some of John Fowler's cannabis ultimately helps improve their quality of life. And I think on the recreational side, we'll see the same thing where if you look at recreational users, I think there's a outset of them who are definitely looking for severe intoxication, but I think the far majority of them, while there are some pleasurable, nice effects that they're getting out of it, I think they're finding that there is some wellness component of it. So they're feeling they use it to distress at the end of the day. They find that mentally it puts them in a good place. It helps balance them both physically and mentally, whether it's like neuro or gastro. Like, I think there will be a lot of bleed over in that middle and sort of that wellness category, and how those products are regulated and sold, I think will all come through that recreational channel.
Well, look, the biggest part,
Please go ahead.
Once things roll out, people aren't going to feel bad about it. Right now, people feel like, I'm not going to name names, but there's people who I know who like they're active, but they like feel like they're degenerates doing it. They still haven't gotten over the fact that it's not illegal. Like, it's not, you can do it. Like, medicinally, you can do it right now. But as rec is rolling out, it's going to be that whole breaking that down and letting people know that it's not a bad thing. And that's what's going to happen with this brand sentiment and who they associate with and the brands that they gravitate to and start buying from. It's all going to roll down to there, how it makes them feel at the end of the night.
Mm-hmm.
I think, look, as we look to roll these things out, I was quite happy to see that Canada decided to preserve our medical system. I think that, for a company like mine, we see the economic opportunity in the near term on the recreational market, which is, import protected, has a different type of consumer, a different and challenging distribution system. But the medical program, look, we have one of the oldest medical programs in the world. We've guided countries like, Lesotho, a small African country. We made an investment. That's actually a Canadian-derived program from pretty much 10 years ago. So we've actually had a lot of positive impact on the world. And I think that continuing that also allows us to continue the research, which is going to fund not just clinical trials into kind of herbal medicines and kind of simple formulations, but more complex formulations where Canada has this real economic opportunity to drive long-term pharmaceutical IP from our cannabis industry. And I think one thing I look forward to is as it evolves, starting to really look at the different verticals as separate businesses. We don't look at everything from junior exploration to plastics as the oil industry. And I think cannabis may not be as broad, but it's certainly going to segment. I think that creates lots of great opportunities for creative strategies to navigate licensing, which maybe is going to be the same for everybody unless you go, the DIN number route. Distribution, which may be through a recreational store, is where you'll get an over-the-counter product for a wellness product versus going to your doctor and getting prescribed. What does that mean to the user? Do you get workplace accommodations for prescribed cannabis that you don't get for wellness cannabis bought over the counter. And I think it just creates a really complicated puzzle that businesses with the right support can successfully solve and drive a long-term advantage from.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, it's interesting for me as my company has a lot more exposure in recreational markets, and for us, we identify as like an adult use company and aren't looking to become a medical company. Even though we think the opportunity is great, definitely on the pharma side, it's just in terms of like a focus and a strategy, you can't be everything to everyone. But when you look at a lot of the Canadian players, like every sale they've made of cannabis to date in some shape or form has started in a doctor's office. So as part of their brand ethos and as part of like what they're looking to sort of drive from a strategic perspective, from a branding perspective, like a lot, if not most of the companies have some medical part of the business, and I think part of that's just because it's a business reality, and I think partially it's what management of those companies feel sort of like a strong strategic move. But I think over time, as John said, you'll see a lot more segmentation of focus, because to build a pharma company in terms of getting products to market, the sales channels, like the consumer base, the price points, the sales cycle, how you retail it, how you distribute it, it's very, very different than a recreational substance. So I think you'll start to see companies, smartly so, like focusing on certain parts of the market and going after that sort of fully, or having like different companies that one focuses on pharma and one will focus more on recreational opportunities.
Let's pick up on that, the access to the market, because going to another misconception that's out there is there's this big concern, and we've all heard them, about dispensaries taking over our communities and OCS stores being located near schools, and what will happen to our sidewalks. And so I want to talk about the future of dispensaries versus government monopolies. We've seen in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan that there is going to be a retail component that will not be government operated. In BC, there's a hybrid between the two. And most of the Western provinces are going to government monopolies. Let's do. Let's face off a little bit between Michael, who's seen a lot of the more retail sales-based stores in the U.S. through his company, and maybe John, if you don't mind talking a little bit then about our government monopoly model.
Absolutely. So, for our company in specific, we thought strategically, quite some time ago, that as we're going to move beyond simply a medical market, we were very likely to see the liquor distribution infrastructure used in one way or another. So for us, building a business towards a non-retail strategy, whether we're working with a monopoly, OCS here in Ontario, or we're working with a private store in Alberta or British Columbia or wherever it ends up, to us the strategy is very similar. It's about strong trade education, building a strong brand through fantastic product, and working those non-retailer channels to get our brand across. In terms of how it actually works out, I think we have this great experiment across the country to really look at different models from a policy perspective, from a economic perspective as well, in terms of where the government's spending money, where potentially the government's taking away economic opportunities, and also the smoothness of the rollout. And I think it would be very interesting to sit here a year from now and be able to take stores and see what works and what doesn't work. But I will say fundamentally, and if you have client space, retail is an incredibly challenging business. So my hats go off to people who do it well, and we look forward to working with great retailers, public or private.
John, I think I heard you speak probably, I don't know, half a year ago at a conference, and you had mentioned, and I'll probably misquote you, so you can correct me on how I'm quoting you, about how the success of our legislative regime and the rollout of our distribution model is really going to be impacted by four factors. And the four factors that you had given were pricing, quality of product, consumer experience, and variety. And on the consumer experience, on the consumer experience side, what are your thoughts on how we're going to get there, and if we'll be successful in an OCS model?
So, to be honest, having met with...
and did I quote you correctly?
Pretty close. So usually I do price, quality, and convenience, but that's just like a consumer brands textbook, so there's nothing too innovative in that.
Yeah.
But I think the key there, if we talk about this, and this is where I think, let's keep in mind, politics aside, whether you like the LCBO or not, they're one of the world's top retailers. They know how to take a social responsibility strategy to sell an intoxicant in Ontario very well, and they're globally renowned for that. And I think they're likely to be one of the biggest cannabis retailers in the world. So quite frankly, I like to buy nice wine. You can travel around Canada. There's some great wine shops here and there. For example, the two major airports in Alberta have two of the nicest wine stores in the entire country. But try to buy a nice bottle of wine in downtown Calgary, running around to private shops, and it's a challenge. So personally, I've always thought the LCBO is a great outcome for myself as a consumer of alcohol, and I think it's a high-quality experience. It's an evolving experience, so we're only a few decades off from all the product being behind the counter, somewhat where we are today with cannabis, and it evolved quite quickly. What I'm excited is it's an education-driven program. So one of the messages from the OCS group is informed choices are good choices. And we believe very strongly with that. And we believe as a company, and as a brand, we're going to have a strong opportunity to do trade education, do our best to make sure that store managers, category managers, and frontline staff, the bud tenders or whatever we're calling them, understand not only our products, but they understand different safety risks, different considerations of how to make an educated choice. Because I think when I heard them say it, I believe in that. Truly, an informed choice will be a good choice, and that's what's going to lead to adoption of the legal market, and that's what's going to lead to actually being able to achieve the federal, political, and municipal policy objectives.
That's great.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up where John left off there, because I think in terms of answering the question, I think you always got to go back to the policy objectives that the government has set out in terms of the medical and recreational programs, which is really around harm reduction, public safety and health, removing the black market, diverting substance from getting into the hands of youth. So if you're looking at it from that lens, rather than perhaps like what's the, which path will take us to the best economic or tax situation, or what will be the best for consumers, like those are different questions than how do we best craft legislation and regulations that actually help us achieve our objectives. So if you're looking at those objectives, I agree strongly with John that you have LCBOs, they have a ton of experience dealing with regulated substances. They have a ton of experience doing mass distribution. They understand how to do that in a retail setting. They understand how to do that online. They understand how to set up retail stores through a province and how to do that quickly and professionally. So if you're looking at it from that lens, I think it definitely makes a lot of sense to have the LCBO involved in terms of retailing of cannabis. I'll take a little bit of a devil's advocate approach in terms of I think the hybrid system in BC is probably the most ideal from even like a public policy perspective as well as from a consumer perspective, and I'll share my thoughts on it, why I think that is. I think from a public policy perspective, having retail stores that are from being made by entrepreneurs and private businesses, I think will help achieve removing the black market. So if you look at how many stores are going to be even optimistically up and running in Ontario and the online distribution in Ontario from day one, I think it's pretty well regarded in the industry that it's going to be very difficult to totally remove the black market with that amount of retailing and online available to consumers. I think also to take a lens from California and what's happening in dispensaries there, retailing cannabis is really hard. It's not as simple as just the same SKUs that have been on the shelf like in an LCBO for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. You'll actually see certain strains of cannabis that will be super popular with consumers, and then 6 to 8 months later, no one's buying it anymore. There's certain edible products that are super popular with consumers. All of a sudden, like right now, sauce pens are a type of vape pens that have taken everyone by storm. And from a retailer's perspective, they're picking those up as much as possible. And from a consumer perspective, they just stop buying other products. So as a retailer in California, you need to be, and we're not, but we're a big distributor in California, so we see on the retail side that you need to be pretty nimble and very engaged with both the consumer and the producers and manufacturers in terms of what's selling and how to actually get that best out to market. With that being said, that's very much from the lens of like a consumer and how can we sell the most product. And to go back to my initial point, that's not the main purpose of legalization. Like, the government's not going to say we had a really good program because we're doing 20 billion of sales rather than the forecasted 10. I think the government will define a really good program as there's been harm reduction, the black market's been either totally thwarted or greatly reduced in terms of its size and scope, and that we've helped sort of achieve those public safety and health goals. So that all being said, I think big fan of public retailers in Canada, but I think having private retailers as part of the program would help from a variety of purposes.
Look, I've been saying for a while now, I can't talk about it from a legal standpoint, but just how I've kind of felt about dispensaries in the community, just addressing that way back when you mentioned it. I think that it's one of the best things that happened to Toronto was having dispensaries, because parents got used to walking down the street with their kids, seeing to the left and knowing nothing was going to happen. They weren't going to have a random, it started adding that comfort level. They didn't realize that there were dispensaries in their neighborhood. Some of them they didn't even realize were there. And people are getting scared. Well, there's going to be an OCS across the street from a school or beside a school. There's LCBOs across the street from schools, and people aren't scared of them. And it's what the dispensary is doing now is getting people used to seeing them as like the brand equity. So when the OCS start popping up, it's not going to be like shock and awe to be like, oh, cool, now that, look, that one's actually, I can walk in and not feel like a criminal to buy from. The other one, when I walk in, I have to cover my face with my sweater because I'm scared it's going to get raided. It's, it's been opening the mind up to that. And I know that from talking to family members and in-laws and cousins and everyone walking down the street, they're like, it's actually really funny how before I was actually, I saw Canada Clank popped up and I wanted to go yell at my MP for letting that happen. And now I see a 420 forever sign in really bad font. And I'm like, I wonder what strain they have for me tonight. And I'm comfortable walking over there before it closed to grab something to fall asleep to.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to have to disagree with Corey, which I rarely do.
I want to hear this. Please, disagree.
Well, just, I'm with all... I have all the respect in the world for a lot of people who have helped get us to where we are today, and that's maybe the old world of cannabis. But I think the reality is of these dispensaries across Toronto right now that there's a real, there's been a lot of gun violence. I have one right next to my house that there's been multiple shootings. I think it's confusing from a consumer perspective because you have these stores that are illegal, but for people outside of this room in this industry where education's a lot more minimal, I think they don't understand that legalization is coming, but there's these stores around. You actually have people who work at those stores, especially young people who have gotten criminal records unfairly because they're working at a store on the middle of Queen Street. They assume, okay, I'm an 18-year-old, how much better do I know? Especially because I know really professional people who still don't understand the legality of dispensaries. Yeah. And you have these young people who are unfairly being subjected to that. A lot of them now have criminal records, have been put in literally the line of fire. Yeah. And I think it's going to make the government, and from a company perspective, I think it's going to be harder for companies to get that education up.
And just because we have listeners from all around the world, for the benefit of people listening in, to be clear, in Ontario, private retail dispensaries are illegal.
Yes, period.
Full stop.
You are right with everything you said to me. 100% full stop, you are right. My thought was more on the psychological, it's not the people who are being impacted there, it's from a psychological standpoint, when people are walking down and seeing it, it's giving that comfort of the brand equity of seeing it there, whether or not, that's what I'm trying to, I'm referring it back to what OCS is going to be doing, why it's been good to have them. No. I'm not saying that they're good right now and I know what they're doing is wrong, but from a you're walking the street and you're so used to seeing it that it's not a taboo anymore. So when OCS pops up, you're not going to be shocked to see it.
No, I understand your point from helping destigmatize and normalize it, for sure. I just think that if you have those stores that are set up and people say, okay, well, someone was shot at one of those stores, and for them, or there was a robbery, or someone was arrested, or someone was shot and they can't even file that they were shot with the police because they're running an illegal business. I think, again, all due respect to people who are pioneers in the industry and willing to put their freedom on the line to be able to push forward. But I think at this point, it's, as John's mentioned already today, it's time to, I guess, there's opportunities in the legal system. I think for a long time, people in the black market looked at the legal system as something that wasn't for them. They didn't sort of giving into the man or being sort of part of a big corporation or working with the government. But I think the writing's kind of on the wall for people who want to participate in this industry in Canada. And if people want to play an active role in the future of this industry, I'd encourage them to look to play in a legal fashion, because I think a lot of the skills, experience, standard operating procedures, like access to genetics, and it seems like even like the genetic library I think will open up from them too. So I think it's like they could do very well for themselves. And
you're 100% correct with everything you said. So thank you for correcting me on that. I do appreciate that. And I've walked into a dispensary in Ottawa and I asked him, I said, what's going on with me and what I'm looking for? And the guy said to me something and I looked at him like, are you sure that this is what I should be smoking? And he said, yeah, you're fine. And I'm like, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking to myself, like, I want to talk to somebody who knows and who can make me feel comfortable with my purchase so that I'm not going to think that I'm going to get paranoid by smoking, because that's one of the stigmas of smoking weed, that you're going to get paranoid. And that's like one of the biggest things that people don't realize. Mm-hmm. And having an educator who can look at you and tell you, look, you're someone with anxiety, you're someone with crazy ADHD, maybe you shouldn't be smoking a strong sativa, you know? That's where what they're learning now is going to come in handy with us, yes.
For sure.
I want to shift gears and talk about products and what's available and what will be legal. Currently, we have dried flower and we have oils. I know that we're going to be expanding those, not at the inception of the rec market, but in a year's time, there's discussion about beverages and edibles. In the U.S., I think everyone around the table has gone to dispensaries in the U.S. We're all nodding our heads. And you see the product offerings that are in the U.S. and states that have legalized cannabis, pre-rolls, and other items. Well, pre-rolls are in Canada as well, but various different edibles, gummies included, drinks. What about patches and other things? Where do you think the future is in product development and options for people that don't smoke, that don't want to smoke, or that want to consume in other fashion?
Yeah, again, so if you're looking, and I always try and make decisions, especially when I'm looking at the Canadian space from a strategy perspective, looking at like the goals of government. So it goes back to harm reduction and removing the black market. So from a harm reduction perspective, if people are not smokers or not looking to become smokers, and I think the scientific benefits or harms of smoking cannabis, it's still a little bit gray in terms of if that's a reality, if there are harms associated with it, or if it's pretty innocuous. But I think objectively having a spray or an edible or an oil product that...
Or an ointment, lotion.
Yeah, I mean, there's like animal health products, there's like intimacy oils, there's patches, creams, sublinguals, vape pens, like the list I saw yesterday, like a March Madness bracket of all the different products, and people were voting. So I think it's pretty wild to see how many there are out there. So I think from a harm reduction perspective, it's nice, especially if there's like education around it and someone knows this spray is going to do X to me. And just for clarity, there are, I guess, some other product, like Hydropothecary, I was writing down, has their sprays, their mist sprays. I think Canafarms, it was yesterday, that announced they're coming out with a Keef product. Meadowleaf they don't really have a cream, but they've kind of found like a neat regulatory way to be able to actually sell creams into the market where they put their oil in, and we're starting to see people come out with non-medicated edibles, so people trying to be a little bit cute to find ways to build brand equity and get products out.
And one of the challenges, again, for the benefit of people listening, is that there's a restriction on stabilizing agents. And so a lot of companies that were rolling out in the beginning, if you wanted a lotion, they would be delivering you the lotion, and they would be delivering you the oil, and then the consumer would be combining the two at home.
Yeah.
I think, look, we were under the medical cannabis program, we're in a very challenging space to innovation, and I think hats off to the companies that were able to navigate a specific route and come up with things that met the law and still made the consumer happy, or made the patient happy.
Like with menthol sprays.
Exactly, and that was, a challenge, I'm sure, and we're starting to see products. And I think fundamentally the challenge there is generally new drugs, narcotic-based drugs are brought to market in a very different R&D and clinical trial setting. And I think that's where the regulator is used to it. So it's my belief, and we've heard feedback on it, where if you want to make more complex cannabis products, they say, great, go out and pursue a registration the same way GW is doing now in cannabis, or traditional pharmaceutical companies do with other narcotics. I'm very curious to see what the product innovation pipeline looks like under a consumer market, where those products are not generally brought to market with clinical trials and hundreds of millions or billions of R&D. They're brought to market by meeting certain safety standards, and they're brought to market to meet a consumer demand. I do think as an industry on both sides of the fence, whether you're looking at the recreational or the adult use, or you're looking at more of the medicalized products, I do think it's important to expand what's available. I think that's what's going to bring more consumers into safer health outcomes with the cannabis they choose to consume. And I think when we're talking about displacing the illicit market, again, fundamentally it goes back to providing the consumer with what they want and providing a demand-side response where you're transitioning demand to a legal market rather than a supply-side response where you're trying to, under prohibition, crush the supply chain. So I think it's open to anyone's guess in terms of how fast that's going to be under legalization, but I think it's a huge opportunity for innovative companies who have an idea and the right advice to navigate a regulatory pathwork to gain first mover's advantage and really develop a business edge.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back to California for a sec. So you have, I think, like 40 to 50% of the market's made up of flower, but that flower, whether you're a manufacturer or you're a distributor or you're a retailer, like there's only certain types of flower that actually sells at the end of the day. And I think a lot of people and a lot of observers and stakeholders in the Canadian industry haven't yet grasped that. So I think there's a handful of licensed producers in Canada who are serious about making high quality products in terms of just like a flower-based product, like John included, and really only a handful of others in terms of what I've seen. And the reality is that a lot of that mid-level cannabis is going to be put into extractors and is ultimately going to be used for finished products. And those licensed producers might be planning that in terms of their business plan and their models, or they might not even know that might be the only place that they're going to be able to sell, because the demand for sort of low, mid-level grown cannabis is just not really that significant. Especially a lot of people always talk, and I posted something on Twitter the other day, and someone talked about, well, yeah, not everyone wants 33% cannabis. Some people just want 10 or 15% cannabis, which I think for sure not everyone wants that really extreme experience. But the reality is that with those more beginner, kind of curious type consumers, they're not probably going out and buying an ounce of cannabis bud. They're probably prefer, especially if legal, to try like an oil, or as more products come online, something that's not a smokable, but something that's more approachable for them. So I don't know. I think that's like a key piece to understand from a stakeholder perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think a big stigma from prohibition, all that has been flower, the weed plant. It's like the wacky tobacco. It's like coming over from way back where people are just scared of that flower, but then all of a sudden you're being introduced to new ways to ingest to get the same high, and people aren't as scared now to go and. Someone might get higher from taking a really crazy hit from a vape pen than they would from smoking the flower, but they're scared because it's a bud. It's, like you smell it, it's potent. And as all these things are rolling out, it's gonna make it like flower. It's the common discussion that like the flower business isn't gonna be a big business. It's gonna be all these products they can do with, whether it's CBD patches for pain and for migraines or for athletes, and the list goes on of where the conversation can go with it. But that is it. That the flower, like
yeah, but I'd actually I'm going to disagree with you twice on the one webinar.
Whoa.
I'm so rude.
No,
because for a long time, like we as a company, like from a flower perspective, like there still is half the market in mature states that want flower, whether it's people have been using it for a long time or people who are new, and that's just like what they enjoy as opposed to other types of products. So the reality is that on the flower side, there's still a market up for grabs. It's just, again, it goes back to actually producing something that people are going to want to buy. And the same thing will go on the product side. Like I see now, because we look at a lot of opportunities of applicants to fund on the debt side with a new company that we started in Tricom. So we're looking at a ton of applicants and early stage LPs where they have like a quote-unquote product strategy where they're looking to roll out vape pens or edibles, and just like flower is hard to actually sell in a mature market where there's stable supply and demand metrics, making products is also hard. Just saying I can make a vape pen without understanding what the hardware you're using, the formulations and the oils, the dosage, the branding, the packaging, how you market it. It's a challenge in and of itself, and it all comes back to really that this is a CPG industry, and I think people are more and more realizing that in the space.
I never said that flower wasn't going to stay popular.
Yeah.
I just think that the edibles, the other way to consume, will become more prevalent as things roll out, because people aren't going to want to walk into an office stinking like, from a cloud of smoke.
100%. Yeah, no.
And we already know that there will be a regime for edibles in a year's time. So a year after the implementation of the rec market, we expect there to be edibles, and the government's already signaled about beverages as well. So those are both coming, just not on the initial implementation. And the reason behind that is that our government's taking a cautionary approach based on experiences that states like Colorado and Washington experienced when they rolled out their rec markets, and the increased prevalence of hospital visits from people that were not consuming in a responsible manner, and that were consuming amounts that exceeded recommended dosages. And I think that there is just a cautioned approach to how to unveil the rec market. And interesting with edibles as well. In Colorado, one of the things that they learned early on is there's all these restrictions on shapes of products, so you can't, and it goes back to the protection of youth, you can't have edibles that are in the shape of a gummy bear or a plant or a flower. It can't be anything fun.
Yeah. No, it's a real issue, right? Like, edibles are dangerous if the education isn't there. Like a 100-milligram cookie, like we all eat a cookie before. Yeah, like if you don't know and you're not educated, it's dangerous.
But we can have geometric shapes because those are
Make it a rhombus.
right.
Yeah, I think, as Mike said and Corey said, well, education is key. And I think it's we can look at banning certain shapes or banning certain flavors, but at the end of the day, I think, there's something much more fundamental to have a good outcome. It means educating children. That's just something you don't have. So, I grew up in a house where underage you weren't given any alcohol, not even a sip of wine at a holiday or anything. And that was just how I grew up, and I got into alcohol quite late compared to most of my peers, and that was something that was important to my parents, and they spoke to me about. And I think in terms of that, it's not, to me, about legal legislation and regulatory outcomes. That's just about good parenting. What I do think is important is we understand that the reality is whatever is outside the box of the legal regime, if there is demand for it, there is an illicit market that probably will sell it if they're not currently selling it today. And I think it's important that whatever the product, I believe the risk profile will be lower in a legal, regulated, and educated environment than if it's left to kind of its own devices in an unregulated space. So from my perspective, bring in the products, mandate that producers have education in terms of clarity of packaging, trade education, etc., safety closures where it makes sense, but try to do that rather than hoping that anything outside of the box is just suddenly going to vanish from the Canadian marketplace.
Right, because plain packaging doesn't mean that you can't build a brand. And I think that you can fight it or you can embrace it and get creative, and that's probably something that Corey, I'm sure you can speak to. You're smiling ahead. Why don't I turn it over to you?
Well,
just quickly on that point.
There's like this age-old argument about, oh God, no one can put any graphics on the packaging. It has to be opaque. What are we going to do? If you're really good at marketing yourself, you don't need to have any identifier on it. People are going to come and ask for you by name. They're going to pick you up. If it's all you have to have is the bare minimum on that package, and that's it. And what I'm trying to work with the clients who I have as well is you got to focus on who you're trying to be to the market, and really, really define that X factor and own it and go after it, and just like, because you want to be a household name where when I'm not saying my mother, but when a mother knows that her kid now has been diagnosed and can go get that prescription, and she can order with her credit card, she's going to order from the brand that she trusts, or she'll ask a friend what they're ordering, or she's going to go into Facebook and say, so my kid was just diagnosed with this and I can order CBD, where would I buy it from? And they're going to start telling her, you know what, I like Med Relief, sign up for them, I like Supreme, I like this, I like that, whoever's selling them. And that's what they want to do through their rec brands, is have this brand that people already had that sentiment, so when they're walking in to buy it, they're not even looking at the packaging, they're just going to go right to the shelf and grab the one that says the LP that they like the most.
Yeah.
I think going into this, I mean, look, fundamentally from a business perspective, there can be a great economic success without the package. The package is one expression of a brand, and there's a lot more that goes into a good brand than that. But I'd say taking a higher level approach, this is one area where I disagree with the regulatory path we're on. We're promised a commitment to a science-based and an evidence-based policy program, and I think that going to a plain packaging regime, which hasn't even been applied to tobacco yet, shows a disconnect between the proven harms of cannabis in terms of what's out there in the scientific literature and the relative safety of the product versus some other things that we consume as a Canadian society, and going to a plain packaging regime. And I would add to that, there's been jurisdictions in tobacco where going to plain packaging has actually increased the size of the illicit market. Brands are part of why people choose to consume legal when we're talking about things like tobacco, for example. And if the goal here is to transition to the legal market, the economic pieces, the health issues in terms of having a safer tested product, I think this is one that could actually backfire. So I would like to see a bit more, and we're talking responsibility. I don't think that we should be wrapping TTC buses in cannabis advertisements. I also don't think we should do it for alcohol, but I do think having a little bit of nuance on the package inside of an already 19-plus store is acceptable and actually would better reach the government-stated goals from the task force and from the election campaign.
Because it is a consumer product. Yeah. And if we completely disregard that aspect of it on the adult use side, then you're missing a big element of it, and you're missing an ability to deter an illicit market.
I'll give you one more example that,
Sure.
that concerns me. We are a cannabis flower-focused company, and products that come from the flower. It's a very nuanced product, it's a bit like wine. There's a big range of flavors, regions, genetics, but unlike wine, there's also a big range of effect. So one concern I have is with so little we can communicate on the package, it's pretty much limited to THC or CBD content. Mm-hmm. In alcohol, that works sense because alcohol effect is generally linear. So a 20% alcohol is half the strength of the 40% alcohol. Well, in many cases, a 14% THC cannabis flower is not half the potency subjectively to the user as something that's 28%. So in our case, we actually generally cultivate lower THC flowers that focus on what we believe is important in the consumer journey, which is the aroma, the visual appeal, and the flavor. In our focus groups that we've done nationally, effect actually ranks fairly low on the list of what consumers are looking for. We actually like the ritual of doing drugs together, whether it's having a coffee around a table like this, whether it's having a glass of wine later, or whether that's using cannabis. And I think the risk is when we can't communicate much else, I'm quite concerned that somebody's going to pick up our cannabis, maybe think that that's in a low potency category, and because of the way it was cultivated and the terpene content and other elements in our manufacturing process, may have it actually take something very strong by mistake. And I'm worried that I don't have the tools under the regulations other than speaking with and educating the trade staff. I can't speak directly to the consumer, what to me is a legitimate health and safety concern.
Yeah. No, it's...
There's a lot of heads nodding around the table.
That was...
We'll have to start doing a video. So, listen, we have about 450 registrants on the line from around the world, and they have been eagerly submitting questions. We do have a few minutes left, and so I want to jump to a few of them. We've spoken about a lot of these in already, but why don't we go to the second one? Why does the government feel the need to spread misinformation about cannabis?
So,
do you think that is a correctly phrased question? Do you think that that's the government is spreading misinformation, and if so, what can we do about it?
So look, there was some political theater going on in the House and the Senate here, I think. I don't know about the countries represented here, but often things like question period become a little bit of political theater. So leaving that aside, The problem with prohibition is we actually don't have the data we should. For a drug that's used medically and non-medically by so many Canadians, you'd think we would know a lot more about it. And sadly, the biggest kind of loss, or one of the biggest losses of prohibition, we don't have that education. So I would say to people in the cannabis space who might view the lack of data on one side, towards positive health, lack of safety, etc., you can also view that lack of data as all these concerns could be true. So I think in terms of what the government's actually spreading is, we don't know a lot. We need to take a low and slow approach. We need to build that education and that research over time. So I do think it'd be unfair, other than, as I said, some of the political theater, to say that the government's spreading misinformation about cannabis. The reality is there's just not a lot of information about it today.
What about the information regarding driving under the influence?
I mean, this is something that we were talking about yesterday, because I feel like from sort of anti-legalization groups, you'll hear a lot of, well, we're not ready, and police aren't ready, and we don't have the testing set up, and the training's not there, and we don't even know what the level of intoxication is, and what about medical users. And in terms of all those concerns, 100% agree, but the reality is that people driving under the influence of cannabis has been an issue for decades. And one of the best parts about legalization is it's forcing us as a society, and then also as regulators and legislators, to actually start addressing these issues in a very real way. So if you look at driving with cannabis, I think understanding what intoxication looks like, I think we have some idea, but I don't think we're fully even there in terms of, is that a THC blood level? Does that differ from person to person? I think we're still understanding. Like as John said, from a science and research perspective, we're still second inning. But then even from like a testing perspective, roadside testing, what types of the actual like the hardware that we're going to use, and like training police, there's still definitely a ton of work to be done. I'm curious on your thoughts, like what...
I like that, sorry, just very quickly.
Yeah, please go.
This is another one that's interesting about shaping the demand side, not the supply side. Canada is a country that's been very effective in fighting alcohol-impaired driving, not primarily through increasing penalties, but through education. So I'll give you an experience. I'll apologize to my dad in advance. I have a very vivid memory of being a teenager, starting to drive. My dad and his friends got together and shared a story of them being young that clearly had some poor decisions on the road. And it was interesting because as they were telling this story, they realized how inappropriate it was. And, for my generation, drinking and driving was a big thing. We didn't let our friends do it, etc. And when I talked to my younger cousins who were just starting to drive, it's beyond a faux pas, just something that you just do not do. And that's an education different program. That's not threatening with, bigger crimes, etc. That's about really educating people not to get on the roads. Because at the end of the day, even if we go to a blood alcohol content, which unfortunately the way it's presented now shows prior use, not current impairment, which is a legal challenge that will ever be enforced, we have a bigger problem. If you're catching someone driving on the road intoxicated, they're already driving on the road intoxicated, and the damage may already have been done. I hope that we can keep people out of their vehicles when they're using cannabis or alcohol, or even when you're too tired. Again, I have some vivid memories of driving to work as an articling student where I probably shouldn't have been doing it. It was quite early, and I got home quite late. But at the end of the day, it's going to be education that keeps our roads safe.
Well, and the early data that's coming in from the United States, where the rec market has opened up, is that there has been no increase in the prevalence of accidents on the road. So they're not seeing an early correlation between driving under the influence with cannabis versus pre-cannabis.
It's funny though, because I actually, so earlier, if people who are listening now, my agency Rainmaker hosted an event this morning where Michael and John, among a few others, were panelists. And in the early organization of it, I really wanted to bring on somebody from the police force, and I dug in deep there to try to get somebody from the drug force to come and comment on it. And went through like 3 or 4 barriers, and I finally got to somebody, and they said they really, really want to send somebody from the drug force, but they can't because they don't have enough to talk about. They don't have enough to say. They're still working through it. Like, their hands are tied on so many levels. They're like, we want to come and talk about it, but we just can't because we just can't say anything. And it was really interesting to hear how the police are also working through this and trying to catch themselves up when in 60, 90 days is going to happen. They still have no idea.
We're almost at a time here, and we did not get to, there were a number of questions on the list that related to employment matters, to the people who ask those questions, I will tell you that Aaron Burles has on our archives of our webinars 2 employment-related cannabis industry webinars, and we also have one scheduled for this fall. So I urge you to tune in and listen to that series. Thank you to John and Michael and Corey for joining us today. It's been an interesting conversation. I think that we could continue on chatting this afternoon, but I'll let you go and continue your Cannabis Day celebrations. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Just pick up that mic that you dropped earlier.
And I do want to say on the education side, if you look at our social channels and our website, we're unveiling a lot of content around making informed choices with cannabis and understanding that you can actually follow your nose to understand potency, sometimes better than the label claim. So it's supreme.ca, and our social channels are under the same.
Fantastic. And I'm getting paper handed to me that we also have, supposed to plug an IP webinar for the cannabis industry that we have coming up called Protecting Your Intellectual Property During the Cannabis Boom. So please tune into that as well. That's on May 3rd. Thank you very much, and I'll have a great day.
Awesome. Bye. Thank you.
Bye now.